I would just take a moment to share with you some of the thinking, the thought process that I went through when Vivica was nice enough to extend an invitation to me to be part of the United Board Speaker Series here. She said, the overarching theme is, leading through crisis, and we're all facing this significant sort of global pandemic and world crisis together at the moment. And we'd love for you to share some thoughts on how we all might be able to at least survive, if not thrive, potentially within this very difficult period of time. So, of course, I started thinking about what this experience has been for me, over the last, 6 or 7 months, since the start of this. So I have to admit to having kind of alternating feelings of commitment and commitment to cause and purpose, to do my job even more fervently, more strenuously, and more fervently, during this time of crisis. And we all need to go the extra mile, to be able to serve our institutions. So at times I've admitted to having that kind of a feeling. But I also have to be honest and say at other times, I have feelings of being scared, feeling overwhelmed, feelings of uncertainty about what is the future going to hold, and how will things really end up playing out, over the course of not just the immediate crisis we're dealing with, but what will our new normal be? What will the future look like? How will the time and the era that we're in right now be influencing and affecting our lives moving forward? So I had this mix of feelings. And as I had this mix of feelings, of course, I'm sure this has been your experience on your campuses as well. There has been no dearth, no absence of email traffic. I'd say every day I receive at least 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 email messages about a new program or a new webinar or a new seminar offering advice on how to thrive in crisis. And there's no absence of information. As a matter of fact, I found the information somewhat overwhelming. There was too much information, it seemed to me. And how could I absorb all of this, or how could I assimilate all of this information in a way that was going to lead me to some thoughtful way to move forward? So, inspired by my own sense of confusion and being overwhelmed, I said, how could I structure this in a way that kind of shares my own experiences and thoughts, but do it in a way that tries to provide a little bit of a pathway or a little bit of a roadmap for all of us to think about how we can do our best as leaders serving our institutions, but also how we can do the best for ourselves, taking care of our own needs at the same time that we're trying to take care of the needs of our institutions. So rather than dive in and get confused with the multitudes of information that I feel like we've all been exposed to, I instead am going for simplification. I worry that some of what I will be saying tonight during our webinar will be simple, maybe simplistic potentially, but to a certain degree, I think that's some of what we may need right now to avoid feeling overwhelmed or immobilized by all of the information that we're being asked to assimilate, and it seems to change every day. There's a new issue, a new challenge. So I am striving during my remarks here for simplicity. That's why I titled my remarks here, Leading from the Head and the Heart, a simple model for turbulent times. So I hope you will find this of some interest and some help. Depending on what articles or emails you may be reading, various individuals, at least among the material I have been reading at various times, have used all of these kind of words that you see here. This is an unprecedented, a disruptive, an uncertain, a challenging, an anxious moment in human history now, as we all, as a global community, confront the challenges that the pandemic presents to all of us. And as I was trying to sift through all of the multitude of information that we're all being inundated with now to try to make sense of it, in my quest for simplicity, it seems to me, at least for the purposes of the talk that I'm giving here today, there will be two basic buckets, two different ways of thinking about the nature of the challenge that we face. And as I was trying to think about these two different buckets, these two different characterizations of our challenges, I was struck by one particular article that I read. Now, this isn't like a comprehensive article, but I like the article because of this one particular quote, because it seemed to capture and speak on behalf of many of the articles that I was reading, much of the information that I felt like I was being exposed to. And it identified one particular leadership imperative. And I thought this quote from the article captured it nicely. One of our challenges that we're all facing now during this period of crisis is to comprehend complex, rapidly changing circumstances accurately, and to respond to those circumstances, keeping both immediate and long-term organizational goals in mind. So there are a set of challenges that we're facing now that are on behalf of the institutions and the organizations that we are privileged to be part of and privileged to lead. There's an immediate set of organizational challenges, and there's a longer term set of organizational challenges. So two important, certainly related, but somewhat distinct sets of challenges at the organizational level. But as I was reading other articles and absorbing other input around the nature of the challenges that we're currently facing, it seemed to me there was also a second leadership imperative that we are all facing and we all need to address right now. And I thought this imperative was nicely captured in this quote that I provide for you here, that this one particular author of this article said, like many of your colleagues, you may be wrestling with safety concerns, with financial worries, and with both a paucity and an overload of information, not to mention your personal and your career anxieties. So it felt to me that this quote captures a different set of challenges and issues to be considered that are much more personal in nature. They're much more first person. They speak to our humanity. They speak to the nature of the personal challenges and stresses and strains that we're all facing. So both of these leadership imperatives are facing us right now, but they're different in character. Leadership imperative one, for the purposes of my talk here, is what I'm going to be calling the head. And we need to lead from the head. We need to use our mind and our rational thinking and thoughts to serve our institutions and meet organizational goals and imperatives. But this second category of leadership challenges, during my talk, I'm going to be calling that the heart. It's below the neck. It's down here. It's something that comes more from our emotional self, from our personal identity, from our personal being. And both of these are different, but equally compelling, I think, and equally important challenges for us as leaders during these times of acute crisis for us to be mindful of and to manage effectively. So let me just take a moment here to dive more deeply into what I mean by the head part of these challenges that we're facing. In my mind, the head dimension to the challenges that we're facing, they're much more institutionally or organizationally focused. They're us in our roles as administrators, as leaders, serving our institutions and fulfilling the professional responsibilities that we have on behalf of the colleges and universities that we are privileged to serve. It's more fact-based. We need to do analysis. We need to collect information. We need to make sense of that data. And then based on our analysis and our review of that data, make appropriate decisions and develop appropriate plans that are empirically derived from actual data and information, the rational part of the work that we all need to do. The kinds of outcomes, the sorts of activities in which we're engaged when we're leading from the head have to do with the development of strategies, policies, plans, protocols, and practices. So these are examples of the sorts of output that we're being asked to undertake when we're operating from this kind of a mode or this orientation in our leadership. And I just tried to sort of think of a few quick examples of some of the sort of leading from the head kinds of products or results that we would be responsible for creating when we're operating in this kind of a way. And in our current crisis period, certainly I'm sure all of you have had to be involved with developing or revising or updating crisis management plans or planning at your institutions. Many of us have had to alter or significantly adjust the way the work of our institutions are being carried out, with significant financial ramifications to that. The need to revisit budget allocations or financial contingency planning is another, I think, good example of the kind of work that we would be responsible for carrying out in this area. Another important dimension right now is the whole notion of risk assessment and risk management, which connects in with contingency planning. What if this scenario befalls us? What if our enrollment suffers? What if we are not able to have fully staffed programs? Whatever those different risks are to the fundamental purposes and mission of our institutions, how would we handle that? What contingency plans do we need to have? And certainly within the area of academic program planning, I know a lot of my time the last few months has been spent thinking about conversion of much of our traditional face-to-face programming into online and virtual spaces. And how can we recreate to the best way possible much of our predominantly face-to-face work into an online setting in ways that still achieve the academic goals and objectives that we set out for our programs. So this is an example of the way our brain will be thinking during this period as we operate and lead from the head. Looking differently, as when we're leading from the heart, we're really paying much more attention to a different set of issues and challenges. We're thinking more at a personal and an interpersonal level rather than the organizational level. We're thinking about human connection and human relationships that are just as, if not more so, emotionally centered, and now in times of crisis, emotionally charged and very high stakes from a personal perspective. We're dealing with very natural and expected human reactions to uncertainty and anxiety and vulnerability and fear and stress. These emote feelings for us, and in our roles as institutional leaders, there's two categories of feelings we're undoubtedly feeling during this period. One is how we actually feel, our own self-care, attention to our own personal feelings, but then also feeling a sense of responsibility for how our colleagues, how our subordinates, how all those with whom we work are personally experiencing the trauma and the trials that this crisis period might be presenting to all of us. Our orientation here is to promote empathy and resilience among our organizations and the individuals that work in our organizations in ways that foster greater emotional intelligence and the ability to rise to the occasion personally as we address these issues. So that's a quick description of what I'm calling managing from the head and managing from the heart. So with that conceptually mapped out for you, what I'd like to do is create a very simple leadership model for the turbulent times that we face. And this is going to be a little 2x2 matrix. And as you can see here, the first half of our matrix is filled out by those two elements I've just described. And this would be the leadership orientation that we need to take. At times, we absolutely need to be paying attention to the head, to the facts, to the plans, to the policies. But we also need to be paying attention to the heart, the feelings, the emotions, etc. So our leadership orientation needs to be mindful of both of these categories of leadership requirements and imperatives. In addition to the leadership orientation, the other element to this that fills out our 2x2 matrix is the time horizon. And particularly during periods of crisis, there are reactive, immediate, unexpected issues that we need to handle and take care of right now. Like today, something happened minutes ago that now require an immediate response from us as a leader, or at least a response within the relatively short term, the short-term period. At the same time we're doing that immediate response, we need to be thinking about longer term, more proactive leadership steps that we need to be taking to address the longer term ramifications of the immediate crisis. What will the aftermath be? What is the longer term plan once we address the immediate fire that's burning and put that out? How do we avoid future fires like that, if you will, to come down the road? So this is my simple leadership model, my 2x2 matrix, okay? And the main point I would make here, and I'll open this up now for questions and answers, would be my assertion here that in order to be an effective leader during the turbulent times we're facing, a good leader should be able to identify and articulate steps that he or she is taking, or specific plans that he or she is developing that would reasonably fall in each of these 4 boxes on our 2x2 matrix. So this would be a way for you to sort of inventory your leadership actions. If you think about a project that you're responsible for now, the way you are approaching that project, are you approaching it in a way that you can honestly say you are taking steps or actions that fairly address the challenges that are present in each of these 4 boxes on our leadership model matrix? So that's that wraps up kind of the first half of our discussion. The second part here really, from my experience, I mentioned this quickly a couple minutes ago. From my experience, I think a great deal of our leadership attention, when we think about what does it mean to be an effective leader, how should I be spending my time, as an effective leader, it tends to be, from my experience, mostly oriented to the top row, if you will, in our matrix here. I'm supposed to be, I'm responsible for developing a strategic plan, or I'm responsible for balancing my department's budget, or I'm responsible for effectively leading a team of colleagues and creating a cohesive team that will all move together in a uniform and unified kind of a way. Lots of focus on what I'm calling the head in my model. So what I want to do now is, I think we don't pay sufficient attention as leaders to this bottom half that I'm highlighting here with the arrow, to the heart, particularly during times of crisis, uncertainty, disruption. Just to the question we were just discussing a moment ago, with people being worried about very basic issues and concerns. So the second half of my talk here, I wanted to focus much more specifically on this bottom row set of considerations. And the way I'd like to do that is by talking about 5 sources of concern and anxiety during uncertain times. Now, I'm not meaning this to be, critical of anyone. I'm not meaning this to be pejorative or negative. In my view, these 5 sources I'm going to be talking about are very predictable. They're very understandable. And they're for any leader that thinks that something is wrong because these things are happening, I would say that's not true at all. We should be expecting to see these sources of concern manifest themselves during the times we're facing. And the question becomes, anticipating these likely sources of anxiety and concern, what steps as a leader, can take to effectively address these 5 sources of concern? The first one of these 5 is what I call loss of control. Suddenly things are happening that never happened before, or certainly things are happening that I'm very unfamiliar with. I don't have a roadmap for this. And I just feel like all of my normal sort of bearings, I don't have my normal bearings. I just have this sense of loss of control of a situation. And it's very anxiety producing. Any of us would feel this naturally. A very predictable, very much a phenomenon that we should be anticipating and expecting. So as a leader, what things might we think about to try to address, or at least mitigate to some degree, this sense of loss of control within our colleagues and our fellow workers? 3 suggestions I have here. One is what I like to call the done to, done by ratio. And this is kind of a cute sort of mathematical formula where if you think about done to in the numerator and done by in the denominator, ideally you want to decrease the value of that ratio. In other words, to the extent possible, you want to increase the amount of activity, the amount of actions you're taking that are done by all of those people that are going to be affected by whatever that plan is, or whatever that decision is. You need to decide what to make, what decision you want to make, or what plan you want to develop. The more those can be done by as many people as possible, the more of a sense of control you might be able to restore. Opportunities for participation. This is a time to not be dictating actions or telling, listen, I'm going to tell you what we're going to be doing here. Opportunities for other people to become involved, to have choices, to have options, if not for involvement, at least options for receiving information, to not leave them in the dark during this period of uncertainty and stress and loss of control. So those are some of the orientations I think you'd want to take, particularly during a period of crisis and uncertainty, to address some of these heart-based kinds of issues. The second source, very predictable source of concern and uncertainty is what I call too much uncertainty. It's almost by definition, right? Right now, we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. I know here, in the United States context where I'm in right now, every day we're not sure, oh, this campus down the street just had a flare up of COVID infections, and all of a sudden what they thought they were going to be doing that day, they now have to do it completely differently because there's a hot spot that has been generated. So lots and lots of uncertainty naturally creates a sense of stress and anxiety and concern on the part of people affected by that. So some of the thoughts or ways I think a leader needs to be operating to try to address these concerns about excessive uncertainty in the outer environment is the power of information. What I know and what you don't know during times of crisis and uncertainty is huge. So what you want to do is have information circulate as much as possible. Even if some of that information is, someone will ask you a question and you say, we don't know the answer to that question right now, or we don't know the answer to that right yet. We will know that hopefully within the next month or two, or whatever that time horizon might be. It's validating to acknowledge what you don't know as much as what you do. It helps provide transparency of information and communication. It's also important to structure the receipt and the delivery of that information in a two-way, back and forth kind of a manner, so that it isn't just me here on the screen talking to all of you in your institutions, in your departments, in your units, on your campuses. If you can be setting up opportunities for smaller discussion groups, for the breakout kind of group that we'll have after the webinar, for chances for there to be exchange of ideas, is a very important vehicle to incorporate into leadership practice during times of great uncertainty. And the last point here is the notion of redundancy being a virtue in the sense of sharing of information. Oftentimes when we think about effective leadership, I think we feel like, well, I should be very articulate, and very inspiring, and just sort of give that speech and everybody will understand it. And that's my job as a leader, to be articulate and inspiring. And then we just go and do what the thing is we need to do. Well, actually, during times of uncertainty and crisis and transition, the ability to hear something over and over has an important reinforcing effect, rather than feeling like, oh, what's the new thing I'm going to hear? If you can think of certain important common ideas or principles or values and continue to reinforce and remind people of those things, that has a very reassuring response with individuals. So to fight that maybe urge to just say something once in a very articulate manner, and in fact, be redundant, be repetitive, because repetitiveness is good as a reinforcing mechanism during periods of uncertainty and trauma. Our third source is, I don't know, I know McDonald's is an international organization, so I knew I wasn't fearing being, US centric by saying this, but I call this the McDonald's factor because it reminds me of a story, that actually I remember from a story one of my daughters once told me. When she was in college, one of my daughters went for a study abroad program in Venice, in Italy. And she was there for the whole summer semester. So it was like 3.5 months. She was in Venice, enjoyed it, learned a bunch of great information, had a wonderful experience. And when she finally came home after her summer in Venice, we said we were welcoming her home, and we gave her a big hug and a kiss because we were delighted to see her back at home. And we said, honey, what would you like to do now that you're back at home? And the first thing that she said was, she kind of looked at me and she shook her head and she said, Dad, would you mind if we just went to McDonald's? And I said, McDonald's? I mean, we can go to a nicer restaurant than McDonald's to welcome you home, honey. And she said, well, you know, I really miss McDonald's because when I go to McDonald's, I know what I'm going to get. You know, it may not be the best food in the world, but I understand what I'm going to get. She said, because a lot of the times, you know, all my friends and I, we'd go to these different restaurants in Venice, and you know, most of the time the food was pretty good, but sometimes we'd go into a place and, you know, I was wanting to be experimental, but I didn't really like the food that much. So the whole point of the McDonald's factor is this notion of comfort and familiarity. Are there elements of the work that you're doing, even though there's change and trauma and uncertainty and turbulence in the environment, is it possible to develop plans that will enable familiarity to be part of what your planning process is? Familiar strengths, familiar traditions, core aspects of whatever your institution's mission, vision, or values may be. The extent to which you can incorporate familiarity into your plans for the future, the more reassuring, the more reinforcing that will be. Even if it isn't, you know, high cuisine, if you will, even if it's just a hamburger, it's a familiar hamburger. It's a familiar element that has a certain calming, relaxing impact when everything else about you is turbulent and uncertain. Another way to think about this too is, while there's many changes that may be necessary, do you have to do all of the changes at once or in close proximity to each other? Can you somehow spread them out into different phases, or identify a pilot initiative, an experimental piece to say, we're going to see how this goes, and then based on that, we'll decide what our next step is going to be. So those are different ways to try to not have everything feeling like it's overwhelming or completely unknown. The next concern here is, or the fourth of our five, are concerns about competence. I know as a faculty member that's used to teaching in face-to-face classrooms, and now over the last 6 months, whether I liked it or not, I needed to become as capable and adept as I possibly could at online learning, which has not been so, I mean, I've done a little bit of online learning, but 90% of my teaching has been in a face-to-face kind of an environment. And I wasn't sure I could do it. I wasn't feeling particularly capable and especially competent at doing what the new environment was requiring and asking me to do. And of course, I'd much rather go with the things that are familiar and safe and that I'm well practiced and well rehearsed in. So this is a very natural hesitation people will have about, essentially, can I do it? Are the demands of the current environment something I can handle, that I'm capable of handling? So any of these concerns about competence, you can address them, and or the leadership orientation you may want to take is along the lines of what you see here. How can you address these worries about, can I do it? Education, training, trials, pilots, iterative sort of thinking, not feeling like we need to immediately solve this complex problem the first time. Let's just make a little baby step, or Let's take one step in a good direction, find out what we learned from that baby step, and then apply that learning to the next step that we need to take. And this is all about having a learning orientation, a professional development and learning orientation to the work that we're engaged in, spending as much time asking what are we learning about what we're doing as much as what we're doing in enacting the policies or the practices that we need to be involved in. And our fifth and final natural, predictable source of hesitation or concern in the times that we live in is more work. There's just probably no way around it. I mean, there's just more on the plate that needs to be done, more things on our to-do list, more activities, more meetings, more Zoom calls, more whatever. That just seems like it's just part of the new world that we live in. Very logical, natural, expected kinds of a thing. So how might you want to take a stab at trying to ameliorate some of these reasons why people might be hesitant? Well, can we think about repackaging the way work has been done up to this point? Think differently about the deliverables and how they can be designed or structured in ways that might still get us what we want, but perhaps in a different kind of a way. There's an incredibly important role for cheerleading here, for cheering people on, for acknowledging in both tangible and psychological ways your appreciation and recognition for the above and beyond work that they're doing, and making special effort to call that out and acknowledge people and with all of the time and effort that they're putting in. So those are our 5 sources of predictable concern and anxiety during our time. So I'm going to wrap up here with a little worksheet that essentially lists here on the left-hand column all 5 of these sources that we've just discussed. And if you could maybe, my thought here was I'd leave this with you as a document that you might be able to use on a particular project that you're working on. If you want to think about a specific activity or project that you're currently responsible for, identify that in your mind, and then think about, well, is loss of control part of what a person might be experiencing or feeling here? Too much uncertainty, etc. Is it present, and how might it manifest itself in the project that you're working on? And as you identify one or more of these sources that might be involved in that project, what steps in the specific context and environment that you are in might you reasonably be able to take in order to lessen or ameliorate or at least mitigate to some degree the concern and the anxiety that you and your colleagues might be feeling about whatever the challenges are that project is presenting for you.